Hi everybody, welcome to the WID report. My name is Alex Guinness. I am a research specialist at the World Institute on Disability. And today I'm going to talk about the intersection of climate change and disability. So first I'll tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to this. When I was in college, I was very involved in the Berkeley disability scene. And then within my first couple of years, the first few years, I got a little bit burned out on it and wasn't involved in the policy so much as the university and university politics and university education about disability. And it was a big part of my life. And all of a sudden, I took one course on climate change. And it changed my perspective on the world, and all of a sudden that ignited kind of a passion, and I went into climate change, and then I realized the seriousness of climate change and the fact that it's going to keep on going. After that, and I'll talk a little bit more about climate change and the dynamics of it in a minute, but after that, after college and graduate school, I went and I worked at the California Energy Storage Alliance. And why this is important, actually, and comes into disability is that the world is changing. And the world is changing in a couple of different ways. Climate change is hitting. We have limited resources and limited fossil fuels and everything to power power plants, to power transportation, even to construct things like wheelchairs. And I got into energy storage to help move off of fossil fuels, to help cut down emissions. And then as I looked at it, I realized we're getting off of emissions. We're trying to cut down on fossil fuels. I realized we still need to keep the lights on. I still need to be able to charge my wheelchair in the middle of the night. And if we're going to install a bunch of solar panels that put out power in the middle of the day, and I charge my wheelchair at night, how are we going to do that? Energy storage is a series of batteries and the rest of it that you plug into the energy grid. This all came together to make me realize that as somebody with a disability and as the world is changing, I am especially vulnerable. And I am especially vulnerable to these disruptions, and it's going to take a lot of focus and very concentrated efforts to make sure that I protect myself and we protect all people with disabilities as especially vulnerable people in a changing world. Climate change is another aspect of that. And then after leaving the California Energy Storage Alliance, I ended up looking at climate change and the impacts of climate change on people with disabilities and the vulnerabilities there, and then what we need to do about it. So I'm going to talk really briefly about climate change and how climate change works. Wow, my mouth gets, I got some coffee earlier, and I guess my mouth is just more dehydrated than I thought. All right, going to talk about climate change, the dynamics of climate change, how it'll impact people with disabilities, and then what we need to do about it. So climate change, it was called global warming, and then we started calling it climate change. It was called global warming, and that was kind of in the popular vernacular, because on the average, the world is heating up. And the reason for that is because we are putting out more carbon dioxide, more greenhouse gases. And the interesting thing about greenhouse gases is they are the only thing that keeps us basically from being the temperature of space. And people will look at how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was at 270 parts per million, which is 0.027% of the atmosphere. And now we just crossed where it's been at 400 parts per million for a year straight, which is, that just happened, and that's a huge milestone. So we went from 0.027% to 0.04%. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but when that's the only thing keeping us from being the temperature of space, it makes a big difference. So we are seeing an increase in average temperature. We are going to continue seeing an increase in average temperature. And for those of you seeing, for example, all the Copenhagen talks and the rest of it that are coming up right now about cutting emissions, everybody's talking about bringing us back to 350 parts per million and 2 degrees centigrade. And I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but that's not going to happen. And climate change is going to keep on going. And people are talking about mitigation and cutting emissions, and that's the only thing that people are talking about. And nobody's talking about getting ready for it. And yet we're seeing things like projections that a lot of the low-lying areas of the Bay and New Orleans and southern Florida are probably going to be underwater, which is the truth, that we're going to see more and stronger storms, that we're going to see more heat waves, that we're going to see drought and food insecurity, that we're going to see all of these negative impacts, and those are the symptoms of climate change and global warming, and people aren't really accepting that and realizing that we need to get ready. I was actually at an event recently with somebody who's a politician and a bunch of scientists, and I asked them, hey, they were all talking about climate change is coming, we need to cut down on emissions, we need to cut down on emissions, and at the very end I said, hey, it's all great that you're talking about mitigation, reducing emissions, what about adaptation and getting ready for it? And the scientist said, yeah, that's kind of right, and we need to do that. And then they switched over to the politician, and the politician had just no clue what to say. And she went, well, we need to cut down emissions and really keep us below 2 degrees centigrade because politicians and everybody else don't quite know what to do about it. So step one is we need to start getting ready as a society, and then step two, we need to look at vulnerable populations, what's going to happen to them, and specifically address their needs. So I'm going to talk right now about people with disabilities and how climate change will impact us. And the way that I look at it is to identify a strategy, which is number one, to identify the impact of climate change, to identify kind of the symptom of climate change. Number two, to identify the experience of people with disabilities within that section of climate change. Number three, to strategize solutions and actions. And number four, to implement those actions. And I have here in parentheses, and find funding to do that. Because that's a big deal. I mean, seriously, I was reading an article about what's going on in Alaska right now, and Alaska is actually to fund the adaptation for climate change, is looking to increase fossil fuel production so that they can get revenues from the fossil fuel industry and the state levies on fossil fuel extraction in order to pay for that, because there's one town of 400 people that's going to it's going to be flooded, and it's going to take about $100 million to relocate that town of 400 people. And they don't quite know what to do about this. It's difficult, and it takes a lot of money. Number one is storms. We're going to see more frequent and stronger storms, and a lot of people have heard about the experience of people with disabilities in, for example, Katrina and Sandy. So they're looking at a huge increase in the frequency and strength of extreme weather events. So storms are one of those, especially hurricanes and large typhoons. What happens with storms is, number one, destruction of housing and living spaces. Number two, interruption of services and infrastructure. Number three, there's going to be storm surges, so some places will be simply impossible and people need to evacuate. So using this as an example, and actually storms I think are a good starting place, because it's something that's more tangible with work that people are already doing, which is around disability-related disaster preparedness, relief, and recovery, right? A lot of people are already saying, simply after Katrina and Sandy, that, hey, this is an issue, even if the amount of hurricanes and the amount of storms stays exactly the same, people with disabilities have had a harder time doing all of these things, doing things like locking down, having the money to establish an emergency kit, having a support network that stays and is available during a storm, having sustained medical care, being able to evacuate ahead of a storm, say when somebody is reliant on transit, doesn't have their own accessible van, the funding to go find housing outside or accessible housing outside, et cetera, et cetera. And actually in Katrina, there are stories of people who simply didn't make it because they couldn't evacuate. We already have work on disaster relief and recovery, so things like support with evacuation, things like ensuring that there is sufficient medical care and supplies in storm shelters, identifying and keeping lists of people with disabilities within the community, and people checking up on them, maintaining support networks, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things that people are already doing, and what we can simply say is this is an important topic to address, this is an important action to take, and by the way, it's going to be more and more and more important in the future, so please get on top of it. And let's prepare not only in general, but in more areas and as widely as possible. And this place where there might have been a 1,000-year storm that would happen once in every 1,000 years, that it might be once in every 100. What's happened in South Carolina recently is a great example. Massive flooding, et cetera. So that's number one. Number two is heat waves. I actually, if you go on the WID website, we have the New Earth Disability Project, and that's available on the WID website, a couple of posts. And there, it started out, the first posts were on heat waves, and newer ones are on migration, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But heat waves, if you can imagine, there will be stronger and or longer and hotter heat waves. We've had them. We've seen that there was one in Europe, I believe in 2003, that is estimated to have led to 75,000 excess deaths. And people with disabilities are especially impacted by heat waves. Number one, because of the body's excess difficulty kind of dealing with heat stress and just stresses in general, difficulty cooling down, often substandard housing, often living in urban centers where urban centers have what's called the urban heat island effect, which means that urban centers are hotter than the surrounding areas simply because of all the concrete. Reduced access to air conditioning within the home, and then also difficulty getting to cooling shelters and lack of support and medical support at cooling shelters. So these are all things that are issues. One of the recommendations I had, for example, was providing, during heat waves, providing excess paratransit and highlighting accessible cooling centers, which simply can be air-conditioned malls. Ensuring that local social service agencies are able to provide excess support during longer and stronger heat waves at those cooling shelters. And again, similar to the stronger storms, being able to do outreach and communication to people with disabilities that might be more vulnerable to these heat waves. So that's another aspect of climate change. Moving forward, what was the... these are the kind of... There's two of these I'm going to talk about right now. And they're kind of the longer term and much more difficult to deal with and strategize about aspects of climate change. And that is, number one, food and economic insecurity. And number two, migration. So food and economic insecurity, if we're going to have longer droughts in California, we've seen reduced agricultural yields. The same thing has happened in Africa, in the Sahara, you know, all over the world. This is harder to deal with, and really it gets to issues of social inequalities, and especially social inequalities hitting people with disabilities. We need to figure out how to cut down on food waste. We need to, I'm actually a vegetarian, and you know, the meat production takes up a lot of excess resources for food production. So really rethinking society-wide how we run food systems, and then ensuring that people have the economic ability, or at least some sort of support systems in order to maintain their diets, maintain healthy diets. I think Marcia and Elizabeth are gone, but this is very much connected to the things that we were talking about. They were talking about earlier in the Feast Project. So there's that economic insecurity. You know, economies will be somewhat disrupted at the end of this. And again, it's just all about economic stability and equality that we need to address. We all know we need to address it in general. And this is yet another reason to get on top of it and have a talking point that highlights the urgency of listening to all of the concerns that we already have as a community, that we already care about as a community. And there's the issue of raising our hands and saying social justice, and then there's the issue of raising our hands and saying social justice and, by the way, future survival, because it's gonna keep snowballing a little bit right now. Migration. This is a long thing that I've been writing about, and it's interesting because migration is something. It's a three-part piece, and the third part is about to be published. There's like a paragraph left up on the website, up on the WID website. Is I was looking at mass migration due to climate change, which I talked about southern Florida kind of flooding through sea level rise. Same thing is looking to happen in Bangladesh, the Gulf Coast, various parts of the Bay Area, potentially New York. You know, people are going to have to move. There's other aspects that will lead to migration. There's a lot of literature out there on simply climate change and migration. And as I was going through writing about this, I said, I'm going to break it up into three pieces. Number one is climate change and migration. Number two is how it'll impact people with disabilities. And number three is what to do about it. There was so much information on number one. And then number two and number three, I searched far and wide and then said, like, I have to just pull this off the top of my head. For a lot of it, there's one exception, which is refugees. And the experience of refugees with disabilities has been studied and can kind of be used as something to build off of in terms of climate change. So climate change-related migration will happen for a few different reasons. I'd say three main different reasons. Number one is unlivable homes, which would be sea level rise, which would be, say, living in areas that have so much excess drought that it's simply, they run out of water. So, you know, if there are actually people in the southern Central Valley that have begun moving because either they're running out of water or because they were farmers and they just can't farm anymore and they've got to go somewhere else in order to make a livelihood. So it is happening to a certain extent. We're seeing that in the Sahara and drought across the Sahara. So that's becoming an issue. Number two is destruction of homes and environments that then leads to people evacuating, say, from a storm and not returning home. A lot of people that left New Orleans and the Gulf Coast during Katrina simply didn't return back. And that is, in a way, climate-related migration. And the last one is when climate change leads to conflict, and then people escape conflict. And actually, there's some literature and people that have said that the war in Syria right now was not necessarily 100% attributable to drought, but a factor in it was drought, limited water resources, and conflict over limited and diminishing water resources. So if you have a war, the war in Syria, that climate change related factors and long-term droughts somewhat contributed to that conflict. And then now we have tens of thousands of refugees going across the Mediterranean, having Europe figuring out how to absorb and accommodate all of those refugees. Then how does that work? For people with disabilities, when it comes to migration, number one, simply difficulty moving, given physical challenges, need for accessible transportation, the need to maintain support networks. So I have a set of personal attendants that helps me in and out of bed. First of all, if they aren't family all living in the same home as me, they're people that I kind of contract with and get paid through in-home supportive services. And then all of a sudden, they realize, hey, I've got to go. Goodbye. My support system disintegrates. And then what do I do as other people leave ahead of me? How do I find accessible housing wherever I move to? And how do I maintain not only support networks or reestablish support networks, but also have the funding and the social support and the social services to do so. So things I've looked at within that in terms of solutions are, I'll say this quickly, is number one, expand accessible housing in general, which is something that we need to do. In Berkeley, right now, there's something that's passed City Council and going in front of the Disability Commission to make it so that at least 5% of all new housing construction has to have a roll-in shower and be fully accessible. Simple things like that. So expand accessible housing, reinforce social services at areas where we can identify people will be moving to, create systems so that social services can easily be transported from one area to another. So start working with the Miami Center for Independent Living and then go to wherever seems like a place that people in Miami might move and talk to their Center for Independent Living and their Medicaid offices, et cetera, and create easily transferable benefits, and then figure out actual accessible and supported transportation over there. So those are those. I've got like 4 minutes left for questions.
Given that, I'll speak for myself,
Yeah.
50 plus years of living in California, hearing that the next big earthquake is going to happen any day now, okay? It's not that I don't take that seriously. So when we're trying to talk to people about the things that you're addressing today, what kind of a timeline are we talking about? That these things, how soon are we going to have to look at perhaps moving? I mean, there's the city in Alaska that I think was mentioned on the news for the first time 3 weeks ago, So I'm just trying to get a sense of, you can't give me a day and a time, but...
Mm-hmm. Well, the tricky thing about climate change is, and this is my frustration with people saying we've got to stay below 2 degrees centigrade and setting a hard number on it. Climate change is not a hard number, it's gradual. And instead of saying we've got to get below 2 degrees centigrade, what we should change from pre-industrial levels, what we actually need to say is we need to stay as close to 2 as possible, and it's looking like 3 or 4 right now, and please don't let us get to 8. And what's happening is some people are starting to migrate, and it's going to accelerate. time frames are fuzzy and flexible. But the thing is also is that preparation, reinforcing social services and building up accessible housing, isn't something that can happen in a week or a month. That also takes years. So it's best to start early regardless. Huh?
Is there a way of looking at this as an economic opportunity
An opportunity.
rather than a horrible thing?
Well,
Is there a
yeah.
way of looking at it as an economic opportunity as opposed to a horrible thing?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that I think that okay. So it's similar to what I was talking about with the disaster prep. Is that there is so much inertia keeping us without any action being taken, and that this is an opportunity for us to say, hey, really, really, really keep us in mind. As far as honestly jobs and economic opportunity, is that preparation and utilizing the knowledge of people with disabilities to help people do policy planning, to help reinforce and build up social services is yes, absolutely an opportunity.
I'm talking about the economics for the whole society, not only for us.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of the New Deal after the Great Depression. Yeah, is that collective action towards buildup of infrastructure and resilience? Absolutely. Yeah, and this is something to rally around. Yeah. So.